and I really look forward to this opportunity to talk here with you all about this important occasion, the 50th anniversary of the start of the grape strike, which of course happened in 1965, September of 1965, launched first by Filipinos and then taken up in a vigorous way by members of the National Farm Worker Association, the NFWA, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Now, I just, as Professor Rosales said, although I'm originally from California and pretty much all of my family is here, I just flew in from the East Coast, and if you've been reading the newspaper or been watching CNN, you know there's something very big happening on the East Coast right now. And that's that the pontiff, the Pope, is of course visiting. So I'm not sure how closely you've been following this, but it was really interesting for me to think about coming here to speak to you all in the light of that major news story. And I will admit to you that in light of that major news story, I actually rewrote this talk, what I want to talk to you about today, over about the last 24 hours, sort of in front of CNN, watching the news on the East Coast unfold. And I have to apologize because in the original version of this talk, I had beautiful images, which I then promptly proceeded to erase about 25 minutes ago accidentally. So I don't actually have these images behind me, but I have some confidence that this will work out nonetheless. But to start this off, I hope that many of you saw yesterday's story in which Pope Francis was visiting Washington, D.C., and was in his Fiat driving down the streets of the nation's capital and was approached by a young girl. Does this sound familiar? Did you all see this story yesterday? Young Sophie Cruz, 5 years old, from a Oaxacan family in Los Angeles, who presented to the Pope a petition on behalf of immigration reform, right? In the name of herself and her parents and of her community. And that moment, which I think probably will be remembered in this visit by this Pope as one of the signature moments of 2015, reminded me, and I'm sure reminded many of you, of just how prominent Latinos are on both coasts, both, of course, here in California, but also in places like Washington, D.C., or in the state of Connecticut, where I live. The Latino presence in the U.S. is multi-generational. It's deep, it's immigrant, but it's also long-standing. So when we think about Latinos in the United States, we have to think about moments like 1965, but we also have to think about earlier moments like 1865 and even before, in recognition of the fact that Latinos have been here for a long time. I think many of you saw the Latino Americans documentary episode about an hour ago. Were most of you there to see that? Which I think, as a series done for PBS several years back, does a pretty good job of narrating the long history back to the colonial period of Latinos in the United States all the way in to the 21st century. And I was very happy to serve, to play a small role in that film, to serve on the board of advisors of that series. And it's been terrific in recent years also to see a tremendous upsurge in the interest of the histories of Latinos in many corners of the United States, West Coast, East Coast, and everything in between. For example, new exhibits that are on display today in New York City about the history of Puerto Rican activism in the 1960s and the 1970s. The Young Lords, which is a multi-sided exhibit in New York City. Efforts by the National Park Service, which I think Professor Rast will talk about in detail to document and make more clear and visible to the broader public the histories of Latinos across the country. Efforts ongoing by the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. To document and make clear this history. For example, a major exhibit on Dolores Huerta in the National Portrait Gallery, about which there is a major conversation today in D.C., even as I speak here. Efforts also out with the Smithsonian and the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the forthcoming National Museum of African American History and Culture, much of which are efforts to gain some kind of traction and to recognize the complicated and deep history of Latinos in this country. So this is all happening not just here in California, not just in the Bakersfield area, but on the East Coast as well, in states from east to west. And I'd like to think that all of these efforts, along with the 50th anniversary commemorations of the grape strike, provide us an opportunity together to sort of rearrange our sense of the past and to understand in new ways how places that have been ignored and peoples who have been ignored actually fit into national and international narratives. They give us a chance to recenter places that have not often been the center of our history telling, places like the San Joaquin Valley of California, here where we are today. So if you've taken US history courses, whether it was here at Bakersfield College or in high school or elsewhere, you probably learned in those courses something about the year 1965, some of the major events that happened in that year, some of the major developments, some of the lasting legacies of 1965. But until just a few years ago, unless you were in an ethnic studies class in your high school or your college, or perhaps in a labor studies class, you probably would have been very, very unlikely to have learned anything in high school or college about the grape strike that began in 1965, about the California civil rights movements that were circulating in the mid-1960s that connected with the grape strikes and those that went beyond the grape strikes outside of the valley. You might get a paragraph in the high school history book that you read or the college history book that you read, and that was not for lack of trying by participants in these movements and journalists and subsequent historians. There were some excellent efforts, oral history efforts, publishing efforts to document and make clear the importance of this struggle beginning in the 1960s and extending through the 70s and 80s and into the 21st century. But the importance of the grape strike was generally passed over in historical discussions in our nation's high schools and colleges about 1965 in favor instead of talking about other major trends in the 1960s. Things like the Cuban Revolution and what that meant for the United States, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of JFK, US military involvement in Indochina, the changing tenor of the African American civil rights protests, the rise of student protests, and new youth musics in San Francisco and elsewhere, and on and on and on. These tended to drown out any attention to this area and to the people who were active here in the mid-60s and forward. If you were taught about activism and politics in the 1960s at all, about the 1960s at all, it was almost certainly about the US South and maybe about the US North. Protests, for example, in Selma in 1965, and the ways in which that critical moment proved transformational for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or other organizations. But when we focus on this area of the country in 1965, I think we get a very different sense of the political and social landscape of the mid-1960s and indeed of the late 20th century. It's a bit like rearranging the map, cutting and pasting and putting Bakersfield in the center of the nation's map and perhaps then turning it upside down. So we're actually forced to look at this place in a new way. Now I'm assuming that at minimum you've all seen at least the PBS Latino Americans episode that was screened this afternoon with images from this area and from the grape strike. So I don't have to actually review what happened locally in the 1960s and the 1970s. And so I want instead to make an argument for you about what all this might mean. There's many ways to understand what happened here and what it all has all meant. And I want to offer you one which I think diverges a little bit from the PBS series that you saw, or perhaps if not contradicts it, at least adds to it and gives you something else to think about. I want to make an argument for you that the political rumblings that hit this place on the map, the Bakersfield area generally speaking, which I would call a great kind of California earthquake of September 1965, one that had its epicenter here, resulted in shifts in the American landscape that of course predated September of 1965. And these were shifts that created a new rumbling 50 years ago, and that in turn sent shockwaves and then aftershocks that continue to move institutions and move peoples today. There are many, many different ways to understand an earthquake, right? Scientists have their ways, other local communities have their own. But I want to focus today in a way on an analytical framework to understand this earthquake, for understanding change that might strike you as non-scientific and perhaps as the product of past eras. Not a kind of 21st century interpretation, but maybe something else, at least for some of you, and that is religion. Thinking again about the Pope's visit and Sophie Cruz's approach of the Pope yesterday. I want to focus here on religion in the movement, in part because the Bishop of Rome is currently visiting the United States, and because his international influence in recent months has reminded many audiences that church leaders and faith communities continue to exert considerable political influence in the modern world. I'm not approaching this as a theologian, much less as a proselytizer. I'm thinking about the politics of all this and how it works. I want to focus on religion today for you briefly with Sophie Cruz in mind, the visit of the Latin American Pope in mind, his Spanish language masses and his Spanish language words to Congress this morning in mind, the canonization of Junipero Serra, which happened yesterday in mind, and his attention to the well-being of migrants and refugees in the Americas and in Europe in mind. And for me at least, all of that raises or reminds us to raise important questions about Latino history and its intersection with religion. Questions, for example, about the connections and disconnections between Latino communities and organized religions. There are both connections and disconnections there historically. Questions about the long presence and the changing dynamics between language use, Spanish and English and other languages, and religiosity. Questions about historical memory and historical architecture and religiosity in the United States. And of course, questions about the historical experiences of immigrants and settled and native-born people and faith communities in this country. I want to focus on all this, as I said, because Sophie Cruz and her family and so many others are doing the same right now. They're focusing on these kinds of questions, it seems to me. They are working through a religious idiom, a way of talking about the world in religious terms that's moral, to raise questions about the past, present, and future of communities like this one. And here's the good news, that if we do that, I think, in thinking about 1965 and about this area, we can appreciate 1965 and the grape strike in new ways, in ways that are rarely talked about and are not really visible on the screen in that Latino Americans episode that you saw. So what can we see about the grape strike if we try to keep Sophie Cruz and others at the front of our minds as we think about this? Well, a few things right off the bat. First of all, if we're thinking about religion, we remember that Latinos, like African Americans and many others nationwide, faced discrimination and segregation in their churches, in their faith communities, prior to 1965, in advance of 1965. And that churches, including Catholic churches, were part of the problem in these kinds of areas. They were agents of discrimination. Martin Luther King famously called Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America, right? And for a reason. It's because these were segregated faith communities. True for African Americans, true for Latinos in California. But we'd also say, thinking about religion, that many of the activists in California who came into prominence in September of 1965, in the grape strike, saw their own activism in part through a religious lens. They took strength from religiosity, they understood what they were doing, in part through spiritual terms, and we need to understand and think about that if we're going to understand what happened 50 years ago. I'd say also that those activists from 50 years ago in turn changed churches. They changed the Catholic Church, principally. They changed the way religious dialogue and religious institutions in the United States have functioned. What I would argue for you then is that the farm worker movement that came onto the national scene 50 years ago in September of 1965 was not just a civil rights movement, it was not just a labor movement, it was, at least in part, for many of its co-adherents, also a religious movement. And it needs to be understood, in part at least, by understanding religiosity. So to appreciate these kinds of points, let's back up a little bit to think about what happened before 1965. Remember that the roots of the grape strike must be found in earlier years and in earlier decades. For example, Mexicans and Mexican-American civil rights leaders in 1950s and 1960s California had grown up, most of them, with some relationship to institutionalized religion, to institutionalized faith communities. Some of these Mexicans and Mexican-Americans were Protestants, right? People like Ernesto Galarza, who was a prominent leader in the 1950s. But most who became active in this area, most of the Mexicans and Mexican-Americans, thought of themselves in one way or the other as Catholics. Whether faithful Catholics or nominally Catholic or cultural Catholics, they emerged and they lived in neighborhoods and families with some kind of a relationship to Catholicism. There were, of course, those people who went to daily Mass, who saw themselves as strict adherents of Catholic doctrine. And then there were those who might only go every once in a while to major holidays or for major life events. And then there were those who were Catholics but never once crossed the threshold of a church, though they might sometimes do the sign of the cross if they saw an accident on the highway or whatever. Not so different from today, right? A very wide range of Catholic practices. But I think those people who grew up in this way in advance of 1965 and who became active around 1965, saw in the Catholic Church at least three things that really mattered for the grape strike. First, they saw the Catholic Church as a very, very powerful institution in places like rural California. An institution with a lot of wealth, an institution with a lot of influence in cities on the West Coast, and of course in small towns, in Wasco, in McFarland, and elsewhere. So power in the church was key. Secondly, in advance of 1965, many activists who became involved in the grape strike saw in the Catholic Church a conservative institution. It's powerful, it's also conservative. A conservative institution with leadership that had been historically white, especially Irish on the West Coast, and that had historically, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, had been very anti-communist, right? Very suspicious of radicalism in advance of 1965. This is very important for understanding how this plays out after 1965. And third, and finally, activists involved after 1965 or around 1965 saw in the Catholic Church an institution that was beginning to change, at least a little bit, perhaps just around the edges, with a younger cadre of priests and nuns and laity who were asking hard questions about how the Catholic Church worked and about those first two features that I mentioned. Its power as an institution, its influence as an institution, and how the church was using its resources for good or not for good. And secondly, its conservatism. Its emphasis, the church's historic emphasis on social order rather than on social change, on the hereafter, right, on heaven rather than right now, on earth, on piety, if you want, more than on earthly progress and earthly rights. We see this in advance of 1965, and it really does shape what happens in the late 1960s. This is a process of ongoing questions about the institution, efforts to change the institution, that developed, for example, with the establishment by the church, the Catholic Church, of a group called the Bishops' Committee for the Spanish-Speaking, which is founded in 1945, the year that World War II ends. And other efforts by the Catholic Church in the 1940s and the 1950s to change itself, at least a little bit. Now, I'll be the first to say that many of these changes were rather defensive responses on the part of church hierarchy. They were responding to the sense that Catholicism was losing Latinos to other churches, right? It's sort of in the marketplace of religiosity, we got to lower our prices or change our marketing in order to actually bring these people in. There's a strong sense in the 40s and the 50s that Protestant churches, Pentecostal churches, evangelical churches were making great progress among immigrants and among multi-generational groups of Latinos during this period. And that's true in California, it's true in New York, it's true in Chicago, it's true in many different places. So that's one of the things that's driving institutional change in advance of 1965. Catholicism, though, was also changing because of the religious dimensions of the Black freedom struggle in the South across the 1950s and the 1960s. As most of you, I think, probably know, ministers and rabbis and occasionally priests and nuns were on the march in the South in advance of 1965. And the sense that was clear in much of their work was that there was a broader moral fight underway in this country between good and evil, between, in the South, young children and Bull Connor's dogs, that religious people could not afford to stand by and just watch. And that, too, changes the Catholic Church, at least in part, or it starts to change it in advance of 1965. In California and other places, there are priests and other religious folks who are becoming more active and more engaged with questions of social justice and social change prior to 1965. And here in this state, it was a group called the Spanish Mission Band, a group of priests based out of the Bay Area who in the late 1940s began to teach and argue on behalf of activism, to try to reach out to Mexican immigrants, to braceros and others, and argue that the church needs to change and be more responsive to the Latinization of the West Coast that was happening after World War II. Two principal figures were two priests who ended up really mattering for 1965. Thomas McCullough, a priest working out of Stockton, and Father Donald McDonald, working out of San Jose. Both men teaching social engagement, teaching social activism, ended up engaging with and helping to teach people like Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, Gil Padilla, and others who become important in the 1960s. So the church is teaching, it's engaging, it's arguing about activism on the West Coast in ways that matter. It's also, because of its historic conservatism, providing important political cover for activists as well. Because the church had such a strong record of anti-communism, suspicion of radicals, these priests could provide some political cover to organizers to affirm that people who became involved in the Great Strike in the 1960s were not barn burners, they were not trying to destroy American institutions, they were religious people, good people, operating through the principles of consensus, good Americans, if you want. This was politics more than reality, don't get me wrong. This is what they're doing is they're providing a kind of imprimatur that helps those who were involved in the 1960s to continue to be involved without fear, so much fear of red baiting. You see this in the 1950s and in the early 1960s in the support of some church people like McCullough and McDonald of a group called the Community Service Organization, the CSO, which is referenced briefly in the film you saw. The CSO is working in small towns in California on behalf of neighborhood improvements, on behalf of bringing sidewalks to small towns, to the Mexican barrios and colonias, bringing voter education, voter registration campaigns, and more respect from City Hall throughout the state. This is happening every place from Sacramento to Delano to Oxnard to Bakersfield to San Diego County. The church is pushing this, or at least key individuals in the church are pushing this and allowing for the development of a coalitional politics under kind of church guidance or the stamp of church authority, an anti-racist politics insofar as it could exist prior to the mid-1960s. So I think it's important to name that this kind of discourse, this religious discourse in advance of 1965, the teaching and guidance and mentoring of a couple of key figures in West Coast Catholicism helped to mentor some of the people who became involved in the mid-1960s. It helped to suggest to them, these more indigenous, community-based leaders, that they could understand, or they could envision another world than the one that they lived in. That another world is possible, as is often said about social justice movements. The church and key members in it began to popularize in these communities certain social justice teachings in the Catholic social tradition, Rerum Novarum, and other papal encyclicals from the earlier 20th century that emphasized social and political transformation, that emphasized political engagement, that sanctioned unionization, and so forth. So this is all very important language, I think, in advance of 1965. The farm worker movement that emerged among Mexican Americans, at least in the 1960s, was deeply connected with a lot of those changes ongoing in religiosity. And just keep in mind, 5 years before 1965, Mexican Americans had played an important role in helping to elect John F. Kennedy to the nation's highest office, the first Catholic to hold the presidency, in an election that was viewed by many contemporaries as a sharp turn away from the anti-Catholic sentiment that had guided much of US politics in the early 20th century, much less in the 19th century. So the major movement, and in addition to that, in 1960, there was also a major movement among Catholicism nationwide to animate Spanish-speaking Catholics that arrived in the United States in 1957. It's a movement that continues to be very important today, called the Cursillo movement, which arrived in 1957 from Mallorca, and it was a Catholic movement, a Catholic practice that settled into dioceses in which people organized 3-day retreats, reflective retreats, in which men especially were asked to think about their responsibilities to their families and to their broader communities, to think differently about how they would engage with the world in the future years. This Cursillo movement that landed in California in the late 1950s was spread around the country so that by 1962 there were Cursillos in 50 different dioceses. And Cesar Chavez was an early Cursillista in California, and on his Cursillo retreat in 1962, he used that spiritual retreat reflection time to actually draft the outline of what would become the National Farm Workers Association founding documents. I'd say also that the Cursillo, which develops in the early 1960s in the United States, imported from Mallorca, also gave many Spanish-speaking Catholics a different sense of religious practice, one that was more, to our eyes at least, joyful, ebullient, and expressive than the Catholicism of the 1950s. You can see this in the activism of the 1960s in the form of the songs that Unionists sang. The song De Colores, which many people know as a kind of world music kindergarten song, was in fact the song of the Cursillistas. It was taught and sung and learned on Cursillo retreats. That's where Chavez learned it, and he imported it from the Cursillo into the movement building in the early 1960s. Now, the other thing that's going on, of course, in the early 1960s in advance of 1965 that really matters in religious terms is the Second Vatican Council, the gathering of church leaders from around the world in Rome to deliberate and determine the future of the church. The Second Vatican Council was a major moment, as you probably all know, in the efforts to democratize the church at the highest levels, again in Rome. It was the moment in which the church declared that in fact masses could be not just in Latin, but also in local languages, including English and eventually Spanish. And following upon Vatican II, it was in 1965, the year that we're talking about, that the National Council of Bishops in the United States declared that masses in the United States could be in Spanish and not just in English. So the kind of democratization that's underway, perhaps at a very incipient level, but underway nonetheless, is developing in part out of the Second Vatican Council. It's a set of changes that's providing new authority to lay people and taking away the sole authority in church matters from just the priests and the bishops, but in fact saying that the input, the wisdom, the guidance of laity, of everyday people, is critical to the church, that this will not just be a priest-centered institution. And those are important principles, I think, for shaping 1960s activism on the West Coast. Vatican II also is critical in shaping 1965 because Vatican II emphasized greater openness to ecumenical cooperation. Right? In the documents of Vatican II, and certainly in the spirit of Vatican II reforms, there was less emphasis on Roman Catholicism as the sole path to heaven and to sanctification. There's a muting of anti-Semitism in the church, and there's a greater openness by 1965 among many church leaders, certainly not all of them, but many of them, to a kind of ecumenical cooperation, working more closely with Protestants, working with Buddhists and others. None of what happens after 1965 could have worked out quite the same way if the Second Vatican Council hadn't happened when it did. Now finally, the Second Vatican Council is also important because of its renewed emphasis that the church should be involved in human rights on earth, not just in the hereafter. That kind of basic principle of mid-century Catholicism was challenged in the documents and in the meetings of the early 1960s in ways that pushed many religious leaders, and certainly many lay people, to move away from just pulpits and out into neighborhoods, to work among parishioners, to think about the ways in which churches and faith communities could respond to people's needs and use the resources and power of the church for political effect. Now all this, I think, shaped the farm workers' analytical frameworks, their coalitional efforts after 1965, their ecumenical cooperation when it came to working with Catholics and Protestants and Jews and others, and their organizing strategies in big cities and small towns after 1965. Activist Catholicism by 1965, by September of 1965, and certainly in 1966, activist Catholicism was clearly on the move. It was on the march. And the Farm Workers' Lenten March, which you saw a video of this afternoon, or the pilgrimage, as it was more commonly known among the leadership, from Delano to Sacramento in the spring of 1966, was a clear sign of the fact that religiosity was moving. Farm workers in that pilgrimage during the Lenten season, leading up to the Easter holiday, marched, as you saw, behind the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? A symbol of Mexican nationalism, and one that was debated because it was so clearly Mexican, but also a symbol of popular Catholic religiosity. Those marchers in 1965, 1966 sang Catholic songs and other movement songs like De Colores that had a religious resonance. And they modeled themselves in their activism very clearly on African American churches in the Valley that Chavez and others had seen and experienced in their travels up and down the state. And they did that in sharp opposition to the church practices of the 1950s, and with a sense that they were moving forward in a kind of post-Vatican II way of political organizing. Now, much of this, I'm quick to say, was about politics. This is not just about religion. It's about sort of claiming a kind of mantle of religious authority. It's inviting in an ecumenical set of supporters that was meant to be advantageous politically. It's not only saying, it's not kind of piety for the sake of piety, it's piety for the sake, if you want, of bread and wages. Doing all of this in the 1960s, 65, 66, was absolutely not pleasing to everyone. There were many people in the movement, Filipinos probably more commonly than others, who felt deep alienation from the Catholic Church and great resistance to this idea of cloaking ourselves in the mantle of the church, marching behind the image of the Virgin. And so these are contentious politics with which many people disagreed. And I also want to say that although I think that the changes in Catholicism in this period opened up a space for the farm worker movement and farm worker leadership to claim to be Catholics, to claim to be working as Catholics in ways that actually were very politically powerful, at least to some, these people continued to face a Catholic hierarchy in the 1960s and later that was very, very defensive and that fought back against this interpretation of Catholic activism. There were many Catholics in California who did not believe that the farm workers were actually marching behind or with religious people, but in fact continued to value the church teachings of an earlier period, who continued to ally themselves with wealthier white Catholics in California and elsewhere over the course of the Grape Strike beginning in the 1960s and then onward. But because of their claiming of Catholic, a kind of mantle of Catholic activism, it is true, I think, that beginning in September of 1965, the farm worker movement was able to win the support of key Catholic leadership nationwide. The National Conference of Catholic Bishops, thousands of clergy, tens of thousands of lay leaders aligned themselves with farm workers in this area of the country where they had never been before, because of their sense that this struggle was a moral struggle and a cause that had religious resonance because of the ways in which it was described by movement activists. We're here, of course, to mark the 50th anniversary of the start of the Grape Strike in 1965. And it's clear then, to me at least, that the start of the Grape Strike in 1965 engaged with a sort of set of arguments or debates about how religiosity would intersect on the West Coast with demands for social justice and social change. Would the Catholic Church continue to be fundamentally a conservative institution, one that guarded its resources carefully and spoke more about heaven and earth, or would the Catholic Church resources and politics and people instead align themselves with the struggles of the poorest members of California society? Catholic activists did not march in lockstep with church officials after September of 1965. And in fact, we know, as I said, that the Pope is in the United States today. The first Pope arrived in the United States for a papal visit almost exactly 50 years ago, in early October of 1965, just 3 weeks after the start of the Grape Strike. That was Pope Paul VI. He was the first pope to visit the United States, and he spent a mere 14 hours in New York City, addressing the UN General Assembly, saying Mass to a large group gathered at Yankee Stadium, and meeting with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Pope Paul VI, in October, in the early weeks of the Grape Strike, and in the middle, of course, of major African-American civil rights activity in the United States, shortly after the conclusion of Vatican II, actually had little to say about US politics. He had little interest, little investment in putting the resources and the authority of the church behind these kinds of struggles. That pope is better remembered today for his statements about birth control and about emotions, birth control and abortions, excuse me, his teaching on Humanae Vitae. So it's clear in a sense that the Grape Strike is underway and certain key elements of the Catholic Church are already a bit in retreat from the ideals and ideas of supporting working people. But again, the farm worker politics, to me anyway, in the 1960s and thereafter, has to be understood in part as an effort to harness the language of Catholic and other religious progressive social teachings in the spirit of Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton and others, to use terms like dignity and respect as keywords in this movement, or dignidad y respeto, concientización, conscientious raising, in the ways the Latin American Catholics were beginning to use the term by the 1970s. Fasting and images of self-critique and self-purity and penance as strategies, as Catholic strategies of focusing attention and gaining support for the most humble in American society, particularly around 1968. These were all forms of what Chavez famously called political jujitsu, right? Making oneself look weak, emphasizing humility in order to use the weight of the more powerful against himself as a way of developing one's own strength. These are efforts, I think, to develop political networks based in religiosity, to develop religious networks to support strikers and to support the boycott. The New York Times famously said that religious leaders were the United Farm Workers' quote, secret weapon in the 1960s and the 1970s. And Chavez would later say that the churches were much more important to his movement's success than were students or labor unions. Right? It was churches, it was religious people, in Chavez's estimation, that were most important in the boycott. This is a language that provided the opportunity for solidarity politics, an identification with the poorest of the poor, to understand in farm workers, or to recognize in farm workers, at least for religious people, a suffering that seemed Christ-like and therefore worthy of attention, and so on and so on. These are then also politics beginning in the mid-1960s, or by the mid-1960s, that I think have to be understood as efforts by the farm worker movement also to work on behalf of the democratization of the church itself, to actually take out, to move the struggle just from questions about justice in the fields to questions about transformational change in religious institutions. Indeed, many of the ecumenical visitors from churches and from synagogues who came to stand with farm workers after September of 1965 left transformed. They left convinced that in fact they could not afford to stand on the sidelines. As one ecumenical delegation in December of 1965 announced, quote, "The suffering of farm workers and their children cries to heaven and demands the attention of men of conscience." Chavez joked in the late 1960s that his movement, the farm worker movement, was really the first to bring Protestants and Catholics together in California and get them around the table. Probably not true, but a kind of an important example, I think, of the ways in which politics can make friends of across ecumenical lines. Some of the most important political developments in Mexican-American history following September of 1965, in other words, over the last 50 years since the strike began, were in fact involved the efforts of farm workers and other activists to change churches. They were inspired by the Great Strike. They understood the power of churches and religious institutions, and people involved in these struggles pushed churches to change. They pushed churches to spend their money differently. They pushed churches to end segregation practices in the pews, segregation in Catholic schools. They pushed churches to be more responsive to the needs of the poor, and they pushed for a greater diversity in Catholic leadership and in the church hierarchy. Chavez, by 1968, was demanding that Chicano activists in the Chicano movement engage fully and directly with clergy to demand a change in the Catholic Church, to create a church of deeds out of a church that had been too full of rhetoric. And we see analogous developments elsewhere in the country as well. In Philadelphia, Puerto Rican activists involved in the Young Lords organization in the late 1960s and early 1970s themselves pushed for institutional change in the Catholic Church, working closely with local parishes on anti-poverty campaigns, but demanding more say in the distribution of church resources. And by the early 1970s, the efforts to change the church, which in many ways do trace back, I think, to September of 1965 on the part of Latinos, had led to the development of groups like Católicos por la Raza, Catholics for the People, which were efforts to withdraw resources if the church was not more responsive to local membership. So all of this was happening, some of it in advance of 1965, much of it accelerated after the start of the Grape Strike in 1965. And 1965 needs to be remembered too as a time in which the Catholic Church began to become more and more of a Latino and Asian American organization. Remember, not only was 1965 the moment of the start of the Grape Strike, it was also the year in which immigration laws changed in this country. The elimination of formal national quotas, which had been anti-Asian, that were established in 1924, ended in 1965. The end of the Bracero program, that in 1965, that created new patterns of undocumented migration from Mexico. The US invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, which led to the movement of large numbers of Dominican Catholics to the US, and so on and so forth. So the work of the farm worker activists in September 1965 and beyond in pushing for a more active, a more responsive, more a more responsive church came at an important moment of demographic transformation in the United States. And this, of course, is an ongoing story. It's not one that stops 50 years ago. It stays with us today. We can see that in the work and in the words of 5-year-old Sophie Cruz just yesterday, right? And the efforts, the ongoing efforts to talk back to the church, to demand more from churches and from religious organizations, have been a major part of the story, one that argues for some continuity from 1965 to the present, not in a way a sharp break at the end of the 1960s, as if all of this stuff stopped at the conclusion of the grape strike. It's not clear to me at all where this is going, where we're going to be with these issues in another 50 years, or even another 5. But what is clear to me is that these issues are important, right? And that we have to understand 1965 in part by paying attention to religious language, moral language, and religious institutional activities. Over the last 50 years, the U.S. has seen a profound Latinization, and the Latinization of the Catholic Church has been even more profound. Right? Latinos have played a more important role in the Catholic Church today than they do in the U.S. at large. Local churches have become sites not only of the kind of continuity of discrete, say, Mexican Catholic practices. Local churches have also become sites of Latinidades, of Latino sharing across national lines, as Latino Catholics from Central America, from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, Cuba, Mexico, come together in parishes, and new forms of identity are clearly shaped there. We saw a lot of this on display most recently, in the 2006 immigration marches, where the Latino presence in the church helped to assure that the largest marches, the largest rallies in U.S. history, which were the 2006 marches, were heavily religious in the way that they played out. And again, we see all of this in the words of a 5-year-old girl yesterday, and in the presence of her family in Washington, D.C., a family that had traveled across the country to make a pitch to the Pope, understanding that a pitch to the Pope and a pitch to the Catholic Church might well matter in the politics of the 21st century. Thank you.